This part 2 video discusses why the Israeli Jews are courting disaster and fighting with the Palestinians and provides evidence for the Jews violating God's standards for his people. The message is directed particularly at Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a patriotic Jew in Israel. Hello friends, this is Unmasked Truth with Harmanjeet Saini, where I provide unique analysis of world events based on the unmasked truth that after surrender Germany continued World War II clandestinely and became a killing machine. I also provide true news that you will find nowhere else. In the part 1 video, we discussed that the people known today as Palestinians are not the original inhabitants of the land, but are Arab immigrants who settled in Israel a mere 80 to 90 years ago. Because of their alliance with the Germans, they don't want peace with the Jews because their charter calls for taking over all the land for themselves and killing or removing all Jews from it. We also discussed Bible prophecies concerning the Jews in Israel. In time sequence, the prophecy that will find the earliest fulfillment is stated in Hosea 5 verse 10. The princes of Judah, meaning the Jewish rulers, were like them that removed the bounds, basically taking over land and houses belonging to others, such as the Palestinians in Israel, for decades. And God continues, therefore I will pour out my wrath upon them like water, meaning like the waters of a flood. Before I provide evidence of Israel's abuse of Palestinians, I want to first remind everyone that God's church understands that God has a 7,000-year master plan for salvation of mankind. The first 6,000 years have been allotted to man to rule himself with and experience the pain, suffering, and death that result from human rule. Then God will begin taking steps to take over the kingdoms of the world and establish his kingdom, which will rule for 1,000 years and demonstrate to humanity that his way of life works best for the welfare of all of humanity. According to Church of God calculations, humanity crossed the 6,000-year mark since Adam's creation around September 19, 2020 on the Jewish holy day Rosh Hashanah, and we are now in the 6,001st year. This means that fulfillment of catastrophic end-time events is at hand. For the state of Israel, as per the themes discussed in part 1 video, the next milestone event is the defeat of Israel at the hands of a German-led coalition of nations, including many Muslim nations. The reason for that outcome is that the Jews have angered God because of violations of his laws and commandments, and specifically for illegally and forcibly taking over lands and houses that belong to the Palestinians. Americans and the British have also angered God by wholesale violations of his Ten Commandments and other laws. That's why they, along with the Jews, are prophesied to fall together. Now, I visited Israel in 1987 for 5 days. Some in our church group who were living in Israel for some time commented at that time, that is in 1987, about Jews forcibly occupying Palestinian lands and houses in Jerusalem and other areas. Even American news broadcasters have shown footage of Jews just barging into Palestinian homes and not moving from there for days, finally forcing the Palestinian families to move out. Therefore, God's accusation through Hosea the prophet in Hosea 5:10 against the Jews in Israel is absolutely true. God says, because of this sin, he will pour out his wrath on the Jews like water, meaning like the waters of a flood. This anecdotal evidence is corroborated by Human Rights Watch, which issued a report on April 27, 2021 titled A Threshold Crossed: Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution, which documents the atrocities committed by the Jews against the Palestinians. Here are some experts from the executive summary and some of my comments on those. About 6.8 million Jewish Israelis and 6.8 million Palestinians live today between the Mediterranean Sea and Jordan River, an area encompassing Israel and the Occupied Palestinian Territory or OPT, the latter made up of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. Throughout most of this area, Israel is the sole governing power. In the remainder, it exercises primary authority alongside limited Palestinian self rule. Across these areas and most aspects of life, Israeli authorities methodically privilege Jewish Israelis and discriminate against Palestinians. Laws, policies, and statements by leading Israeli officials make plain that the objective of maintaining Jewish Israeli control over demographics, political power, and land has long guided government policy. In pursuit of this goal, authorities have dispossessed, confined, forcibly separated, and subjugated Palestinians by virtue of their identity to various degrees of intensity. In certain areas, as described in the report, these deprivations are so severe that they amount to the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. A graphic in the report summarizes the situation faced by the Jews and Palestinians in Israel. Under the title Integrating Jews, it states 6.8 million Jewish Israelis free to live throughout Israel, East Jerusalem, and most of the West Bank, and then separating 6.8 million Palestinians. First, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, about 1.6 million of them, barred effectively from hundreds of small Jewish towns and largely concentrated on about only 3% of the land. Then, in the occupied Palestinian territory, East Jerusalem residents number 400,000. Israel guarantees residency rights to Jewish Israelis, but for Palestinians, residency is conditional and revocable. Then the West Bank ID holders, there are 2.7 million of them. They're barred effectively from building in the majority of the West Bank or entering Israeli settlements. Then the Gaza ID holders, about 2.1 million of them, they are barred with few exceptions from leaving Gaza or living in the other part of the occupied territories, West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The report goes on to elaborate on the crimes of apartheid and persecution committed by the Jews against the Palestinians in Israel. A stated aim of the Israeli government is to ensure that Jewish Israelis maintain domination across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. The Knesset in 2018 passed a law with constitutional status affirming Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, declaring that within that territory the right to self determination is unique to the Jewish people, and establishing Jewish settlement as a national value. To sustain Jewish Israeli control, Israeli authorities have adopted policies aimed at mitigating what they have openly described as a demographic threat that Palestinians pose. Those policies include limiting the population and political power of Palestinians, granting the right to vote only to Palestinians who live within the borders of Israel as they existed from 1948 to June 1967, and limiting the ability of Palestinians to move to Israel from the occupied Palestinian territories and from anywhere else to Israel or the occupied territories. Other steps are taken to ensure Jewish domination, including a state policy of separation of Palestinians between the West Bank and Gaza, which prevents the movement of people and goods within the occupied territories, and Judaization of areas with significant Palestinian populations, including Jerusalem as well as the Galilee and the Negev in Israel. This policy, which aims to maximize Jewish Israeli control over land, concentrates the majority of Palestinians who live outside Israel's major, predominantly Jewish cities into dense, underserved enclaves and restricts their access to land and housing while nurturing the growth of nearby Jewish communities. Pursuant to these policies, Israeli authorities have carried out a range of inhumane acts in the occupied territories. Those include sweeping restrictions on the movement of 4.7 million Palestinians there, the confiscation of much of their land, the imposition of harsh conditions, including categorical denial of building permits in large parts of the West Bank, which has led thousands of Palestinians to leave their homes under conditions that amount to forcible transfer, the denial of residency rights to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and their relatives, largely for being abroad when the occupation began in 1967 or for long periods during the first few years of the occupation, or as a result of the effective freeze on family reunification over the last 2 decades and the suspension of basic civil rights such as freedom of assembly and association, depriving Palestinians of the opportunity to have a voice in a wide range of affairs that most affect their daily lives and futures. Many of these abuses, including categorical denials of building permits, mass residency revocations or restrictions, and large scale land confiscations, have no legitimate security justifications. On the basis of its research, Human Rights Watch concludes that the Israeli government has demonstrated an intent to maintain the domination of Jewish Israelis over Palestinians across Israel and the occupied territories. Their systematic oppression amounts to the crime of apartheid. Their policies and practices intentionally and severely deprived millions of Palestinians of key fundamental rights, including to residency, private property, and access to land, services, and resources on a widespread and systematic basis by virtue of their identity as Palestinians. These amount to the crime against humanity of persecution. I concur with the conclusions of the report. The executive summary then goes on to provide extensive damning statistics on the land the Jews have occupied, some previously privately owned by Palestinians, and hemmed in the Palestinians into non contiguous enclaves. That is precisely what God has accused the Jews of doing in Hosea 5, verse 10, inviting his wrath on them. Jews in Israel need to learn that God is the creator also of Palestinians as he is of them, and he is equally concerned about the welfare of all his creatures. Then here are excerpts from the executive summary again. Israeli policies have sought to engineer and maximize the number of Jews as well as the land available to them in Israel and the portions of the occupied territories coveted by the Israeli government for Jewish settlement. At the same time, by restricting the residency rights of Palestinians, Israeli policy seeks to minimize the number of Palestinians and the land available to them in those areas. The level of repression is most severe in the occupied territories, although often less severe aspects of similar policies can be found within Israel. In the West Bank, authorities have confiscated more than 2 million dunams of land. 1,000 dunams equals 100 hectares or about 250 acres or 1 square kilometer for a total of 2,000 square kilometers from Palestinians, making up more than one-third of the West Bank, including tens of thousands of dunams that they acknowledge are privately owned by Palestinians. One common tactic they have used is to declare territory, including privately owned Palestinian land, as state land. The Israeli group Peace now estimates that the Israeli government has designated about 1.4 million dunams of land, or about a quarter of the West Bank, as state land. The gossip has also found that more than 30% of the land used for settlements is acknowledged by the Israeli government as having been privately owned by Palestinians. Of the more than 675,000 dunams of land, of state land that Israeli authorities have allocated for use by third parties in the West Bank, They have earmarked more than 99% for use by Israeli civilians, according to government data. Land grabs for settlements and the infrastructure that primarily serves settlers effectively concentrate Palestinians in the West Bank, according to Beit Salam, into 165 non-contiguous territorial islands. Israeli authorities have also made it virtually impossible in practice for Palestinians in Area C, the roughly 60% of the West Bank that the Oslo Accords place under full Israeli control, as well as those in East Jerusalem, to obtain building permits. In Area C, for example, authorities approved less than 1.5% of applications by Palestinians to build between 2016 and 2018 to 2021 in total, a figure 100 times smaller than the number of demolition orders it issued in the same period, according to official data. Israeli authorities have razed thousands of Palestinian properties in these areas for lacking a permit, leaving thousands of families displaced. By contrast, according to Peace Now, Israel authorities began contributions on more than 23,696 housing units between 2019 and 2010. And in Israeli settlements in Area C, and then transfer of an occupying power civilian population to an occupied territory violates the Fourth Geneva Convention. In Jerusalem, the government's plan for the municipality, including both the west and occupied east of the city, sets the goal of maintaining a solid Jewish majority in the city and a target demographic ratio of 70% Jews and 30% Arabs, later adjusted to a 60-40 ratio after authorities acknowledged that that this goal is not attainable in light of the demographic trends. The Israeli government has also carried out discriminatory seizures of land inside Israel. Authorities have seized through different mechanisms of at least 4.5 million dunams of land from Palestinians, according to historians, constituting 65 to 75% of all land owned by Palestinians before 1948 to 1975. Before 1948 and 40 to 60% of the land that belonged to Palestinians who remained after 1948 and became citizens of Israel. Authorities in the early years of the state declared land belonging to a disabled person or absentee property or closed military zones, then took it over, converted it to state land, and built Jewish communities there. Authorities continue to block Palestinian citizen landowners from accessing land that was confiscated from them. A 2003 comment states Commission report found that the expropriation of activities were clearly and explicitly harnessed to the interests of the Jewish majority, and that state lands, which constitute 93% of all land in Israel, effectively serve the objective of Jewish settlement. Since 1948, the government has authorized the creation of more than 900 Jewish localities in Israel, but it has allowed only a handful of government planned townships and villages for Palestinians, created largely to concentrate previously displaced Bedouin communities along the Negev. Land confiscations and other discriminatory land policies in Israel hem in Palestinian municipalities inside Israel, denying them opportunities for natural expansion enjoyed by Jewish municipalities. The vast majority of Palestinian citizens, who make up around 19% of the Israeli population, live in these communities, which have an estimated jurisdiction over less than 3% of all land in Israel. While Palestinians in Israel can move freely, and some live in mixed cities such as in Haifa, Tel Aviv, Jaffa, and Acre, Israeli law permits small towns to exclude prospective residents based on their asserted incompatibility with the town's socio-cultural fabric. According to a study by a professor of Technion Israel Institute of Technology in Haifa, there are more than 900 small Jewish towns, including kibbutzim, across Israel that can restrict who lives there. None of them have any Palestinians living among them. In the Negev in Israel, Israeli authorities have refused to legally recognize 35 million Bedouin communities, making it impossible for the 90,000 or so residents to live lawfully in the communities they have lived in for decades. Instead, authorities have sought to concentrate Bedouin communities in larger recognized townships in order, as expressed in government plans and statements by officials, to maximize the land available for Jewish communities. Israeli law considers all buildings in these unrecognized villages to be illegal, and authorities have refused to connect most to the natural electricity, and authorities have refused to connect most of the national electricity or water grids, or to provide even basic infrastructure such as paved roads or sewage systems. The communities do not appear on official maps, most have no educational facilities, and residents live under constant fear of having their homes demolished. Israeli authorities demolished more than 10,000 Bedouin homes in the Negev between 2013 and 2019, according to government data. They razed the unrecognized village that challenged the expropriation of its lands, Arakib, 185 times. The report also criticized the Gaza blockade. Authorities have also sharply restricted the entry and exit of goods to and from Gaza, which alongside Egypt, are often shutting its border, effectively seals it off from the outside world. These restrictions have contributed to limiting access to basic services, devastating the economy, and making 90% of the population reliant on humanitarian aid. Families in Gaza in recent years have had to make do without centrally provided electricity for between 12 to 20 hours per day, depending on the period. Water is also critically scarce. The UN considers more than 96% of the water supply in Ghana unfit for human consumption. Some of the writers of the report may have lived in the neighborhoods in Israel which are always in danger of rocket, drone, or terrorist attacks from the Palestinians. In writing the report, they have not taken into consideration the constant tension the Jews face and why they do whatever they can to stop the Gaza Palestinians from manufacturing rockets and firing them into Israel. If that requires blockading China, so be it. I experienced just a fraction of that tension on my 5-day visit to Israel. The writers have not considered even Egypt has blockaded Gaza because they fear Hamas bringing violence to Egypt. Though Hamas has fired rockets only into Israel and none into Egypt, the first place to begin for pursuing peace is showing in your documents that you genuinely want peace. Hamas charter states that all the land of Israel belongs to the Palestinians. Charter states that all the land of Israel belongs to the Hamas till Judgment Day, and no one has the authority to change that Judgment Day. So, no one has the authority to change that clearly they don't want to live in peace with the Jews in the land of Israel. Under these circumstances, Israel has every right to make sure that the life of a no Israeli citizen is jeopardized. Israel does whatever it can to ensure that, and that means disproportionately punishing Hamas every time it fires rockets into Israel or commits a terrorist act. Palestinian civilians dying between Hamas and embeds itself with its weapons in civilian areas and buildings. Many Muslims appear to employ this cowardly tactic, and Muslim civilians pay the price. Hamas bears the responsibility for such civilian deaths into Israel. Just a few thousand Hamas leaders and fighters are holding the Peruvian population in Gaza hostage. I think Israel does absolutely the right thing in targeting and killing as many Hamas militants and leaders it can, as it has done during the May 2021 violence and other various military engagements. If many Palestinian activities are killed as collateral damage, which Israel tries to minimize by issuing two warnings prior to military action, Hamas bears responsibility for those deaths. The report accuses the Jews of having used excessive and vastly disproportionate force for decades to quell protests and disturbances, at least cost to millions. The report states since 2008, the Israeli army has launched three large scale military offensives in Gaza in the context of hostilities which armed Palestinian groups. Those offensives have induced apparently deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure that killed well over 2,000 civilians. In addition, Israeli forces have begun regularly on Palestinian demonstrators and others who have approached fences separating Gaza and Israel in circumstances when they did not pose an imminent threat to life, killing 219 passengers in 2018 and 2019 alone and maintaining thousands. I vehemently agree with the characterization of Israelis' actions. Every Jew in Israel was always under tension, fearing whether a Palestinian suicide bomber wearing a child or youth vest with explosives in the belt and its waist, or Israeli soldier having lost his eyes. How else can a people stop such tactics except through an overwhelming response demonstrating that there will be terrible consequences for such misbehavior? The report states Israeli authorities have used their control over the Palestinian registry on the West Bank and Gaza. The list of Palestinians they consider lawful residents for purposes of issuing legal status and identity cards to deny residency to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Israeli authorities refused to register at least 270,000 Palestinians when the aggression began to ease. The freeze effectively bars Palestinians from acquiring legal status for spouses or relatives not already registered. These restrictions have the effect of limiting the Palestinian population to the West Bank only. I agree with the report that some of these are inhumane policies and grossly discriminate against Palestinians. I agree with the report's following assessment about Israel's entitlement to protection and safety, not taking it as license to oppress the Palestinians. International human rights law gives broad latitude to governments in setting their immigration policies. There is nothing in international law to bar Israel from promoting Jewish immigration. Jewish Israelis, many of whom historically migrated to mandatory Palestine or later to Israel to escape anti Semitic production in different parts of the world, are entitled to protection of their safety and fundamental rights. However, that latitude does not give a state the prerogative to discriminate against people who already live in that country, including with respect to rights concerning family reunification and against people who have a right to return to the country. Palestinians are also enlightened to protection of their safety, are also entitled to protection of their safety and fundamental rights. Israeli policies amounting to apartheid and discrimination are a cause of violence. As I noted earlier, Hamas and the PLO do not want peace with the Jews because their alliance overlords the Germans will not permit them to do so. Therefore, unless the Palestinians break with the Germans, no place can be accepted in Israel, and if the Palestinians leaders break with Germany, they will become German targets and can expect to be assassinated. That's how the games oppose operating system. But the Israeli policies against the Palestinians force the population to pay heed to their leaders and continue as to population and violence against the Jews. As a reminder from part 1 video, here are the scriptures in which God holds Israel, biblical Jordan, responsible for the evidence. Ezekiel 8 verses 17 to 18 states, "And if you've seen this, son of man," he asked, "is it nothing to the people of Judah that they commit these abominable sins, leading the whole nation into violence, thumbing their noses at me, and provoking my spirit? Therefore I will respond in fury, I will neither pity nor spare them, and though they cry aloud for mercy, I will not listen." And Ezekiel 9 verses 9 to 11, "Then said he unto me, The iniquity of the house of Israel," meaning America and British Commonwealth nations, "and Judah, the Jews, and the Lord has forsaken the earth, and the Lord sees not. And as far as me also, please, my eye shall not separate, neither will I have pity, but I will have recompense on whom I will have recompense. And behold, the man clothed with linen, which had the ink horn by his side, an angel, reported the matter, saying, I have done as you have done. Condemn me. This shows that the punishment will be meted out and cannot be stopped because the Jews are unlikely repentant. Micah 3 verses 9 to 12 state, Hear this, I pray you, O heads of the house of Jacob, which refers to all 12 tribes of Israel, including the Jews, and then princes of Russia, include America and British Commonwealth nations, and they build up Zion with blood and Jerusalem with equity. Yet they will lean upon the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? No evil shall come upon us. Therefore shall Zion for your sake be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the house as the higher places of the mount of the forest. I intend to avoid a Jewish bias in my analysis of the situation and offer suggestions in part 3 video on how to handle the problems. Based on God's perspective and his accusations against the Jews and Palestinians and his prophecies, like many devout men of religion, I dread to go against God's will. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please continue to watch my videos and read my articles on important world events, World War III watch, politics, international business, advice on health and medical problems, and much more for in-depth and insightful analysis. Please also subscribe to my YouTube and Facebook channels Unmasked Truth with Harmanjeet Saini to show and get information on the latest videos.